Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to take that stack of sources you send us, all the articles, the academic models, the really dense standards, and just pull out the vital knowledge. We want to give you a serious shortcut to being, well, truly well-informed. Today, we are wading into a subject that sits right at the nexus of, strategy, finance, and culture. It's all about how organizations make decisions about uncertainty.
Right. And every single organization, from the tiniest startup trying to get funding to a massive multinational, they're constantly facing these choices.
Absolutely. From innovation budgets to safety protocols, and we all think we know what risk is, but the moment you step into a boardroom or a project management office, you realize there's this whole other formal, specific language they use to manage it.
And that language is often incredibly confusing. It's maybe the ultimate source of ambiguity in corporate governance.
I can see that.
Organizations just need a central guiding principle that tells them, how much pain are we willing to accept for a potential gain? They need to know where to draw the line on security, on financial exposure, on how fast they roll out a new product.
And that central concept, that's risk appetite.
That's the one.
It's the centerpiece of all modern enterprise risk management. But if you, our listener, have ever sat through a presentation on this or tried to read a policy document, you've probably hit that jargon wall. You're asked to distinguish between appetite, tolerance, threshold, attitude.
And they're used interchangeably all the time.
All the time. But in practice, they are radically different concepts that actually define the acceptable boundaries of how a company can behave.
So our mission today is just that, absolute clarity. For you, the curious learner, we're going to unpack the formal definitions that govern this whole field.
And where are we pulling this from?
We're drawing on really rigorous sources.
Yeah.
So we have established academic models, like the RARA framework, for example, and then the definitive global standards.
Yeah.
Specifically, ISO 31000.
The big one.
The big one. And these sources, they help us cut through all that operational ambiguity, and they really provide the authoritative distinction between these terms that seem to overlap.
And we're going to make sure that you know not just what the definitions are, but more importantly, why these distinctions matter. What's the advantage this clarity gives you in a strategy meeting or a resource debate?
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we need to start with the core philosophy, with the definition of risk appetite itself.
So when we talk about risk appetite, at its heart, we are really talking about acceptance.
Acceptance.
At its most fundamental level, risk appetite is the level of risk an organization is prepared to accept. Or, and this is the crucial part, prepared to retain in pursuit of its objective.
Ah, that framing retained risk, that's really insightful.
It is.
It immediately shifts the mindset, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It tells us this isn't about creating some kind of zero-risk environment.
Which is impossible anyway. Impossible, and it would be paralyzing. It's about making a deliberate choice to, live with a certain amount of uncertainty. Because that uncertainty is the cost of doing business, or maybe more importantly, the cost of innovation.
Exactly right. The International Organization for Standardization, ISO 31000, which is, the global benchmark for risk management, it formally defines it as the amount and type of risk that an organization is willing to pursue or retain.
Amount and type.
Amount and type. And it's worth pausing on why a standard like that is so necessary. I mean, without a formal, recognized definition, every organization just invents its own vocabulary.
Which leads to total confusion when you're dealing with regulators or international partners or even your own subsidiaries.
Complete confusion. And that specific phrase, pursue or retain, that is the strategic crux of the whole thing.
Right. It changes the conversation from a purely defensive posture, let's avoid bad things, to an offensive strategy. We're talking about deliberately pursuing risk because it offers a potential reward. It's a balancing act.
It's the organizational sweet spot. If you're excessively cautious, if your appetite is way too low, you just stagnate.
You're safe, but...
You're safe, but your competitors are innovating all around you, and they're going to capture the market.
And on the other hand, if your appetite is too high...
You risk total failure, catastrophe. So risk appetite, when it's defined correctly, is that measurable point where the potential benefits of growth finally outweigh the inevitable threats that come with change and competition.
And that leads us right into, I think, the first major intellectual challenge here, which is the relationship between risk appetite and risk management.
Ah, yes.
Intuitively, they feel sequential. One feels like the cause and the other feels like the effect.
The classic chicken or the egg debate in all the risk literature. And if you poll a room full of managers, most of them will argue that risk appetite has to come first.
That's what I would assume.
They assume that strategy dictates the appetite,
Hmm.
and then you go and set up the management systems to monitor that chosen level of risk.
Yeah, that's certainly the intuitive argument. I decide how hungry I am for profit. That's my appetite. And then I manage my investments to match it. The appetite dictates the management strategy.
Right. It seems logical.
If the board says, we're a high-risk, high-reward organization, that attitude should surely inform everything else that follows.
It seems like it should.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the most rigorous, modern analysis that comes from our sources, the relationship is actually, well, it's counterintuitive. When the analysis is truly rigorous and quantitative, the risk appetite is actually a consequence of a deep risk management analysis.
Yeah.
It is not the precursor.
Wait, hold on. Let's dig into that, because that completely flips the script on what I think most people assume. You're saying the organization doesn't just start by stating we want to be high risk. They start by analyzing their capacity for loss.
Precisely. We have to make a distinction here between simple risk management and rigorous risk management.
Okay.
Simple RM, it identifies a hazardous event, a fire, a cyber attack, whatever, and it looks at how to minimize its immediate impact. Rigorous RM has to account for something way more complex. Collateral effects, secondary losses, cascading failures that just compound the initial problem.
So it's not just, did our server crash?
No.
It's, okay, if the server crashes, what's the ripple effect on our compliance obligations, our competitive position in 9 months, the potential regulatory fines, the drop in investor confidence, all of it?
Exactly. Rigorous risk management involves things like stress testing and probabilistic modeling that analyzes the total loss exposure against the organization's structural reserves. It asks the really hard question, can we survive the absolute worst-case scenario? And if we can, what's the cost of that survival? And this is where the competitive context becomes so crucial.
The sources talk about this concept of cover. Can you explain how an organization's cover determines its appetite?
Yeah, think of cover as your financial and your strategic insulation, your padding. It includes your available capital, your insurance, any redundant supply chains you might have, your reputational goodwill, the technological lead you have over your competitors. The amount of risk an organization can responsibly put on the table depends entirely on the financial and strategic cover they have, if that loss actually happens. And this is always analyzed relative to the competition.
Ah, I see the strategic move here. So if a company is in a really competitive market and they determine through this rigorous risk management that their cash reserves and their operational redundancy are just way greater than their rivals,
Well, then they have a strategic advantage in risk-taking.
they can afford to be bolder.
Yes. If you have ample cover, the logical, strategically sound move is to adopt a hungry appetite for risk, because you can sustain the market downturns or the project failures that are going to wipe out your less protected rivals. Your appetite isn't a choice made in a vacuum. It's determined by the cold, hard analysis of your survival capacity compared to everyone else. The rigor of the management analysis, the stress testing that dictates the boldness of the final strategic appetite declaration.
So instead of risk appetite being the starting gun for the race, it's actually the end product of this really sophisticated organizational health check. It's the logical conclusion you draw from the question, what's the maximum we can strategically afford to lose relative to the market to gain an advantage?
That is the key insight. The declaration of appetite, whether it's high or low or somewhere in the middle, that's the formal mechanism for aligning that analytical inclusion with the strategic goals of the organization.
Okay, so now that we've established that core definition appetite as a strategic consequence, we have to wade into that vocabulary minefield. Because this is where, in practice, most organizational policy just becomes a mess of confusion. We have these 3 supporting terms: threshold, attitude, and tolerance. That sound like they're synonyms, but they serve these distinct critical functions.
Let's start with risk threshold. If risk appetite is the overall strategy, the risk threshold is the hard, measurable limit of that strategy.
How should we visualize that? What's a good analogy for the threshold?
Imagine risk appetite is a road, and it has a clearly marked speed limit. That speed limit is the threshold.
Okay, so it's the upper boundary.
It is the upper limit of the defined risk appetite. If appetite is the entire menu of acceptable choices, the risk threshold is the single most aggressive, the maximum cost item on that menu that the organization allows itself to order. Formally, the threshold is the maximal exposure before risk treatment is deemed necessary.
And risk treatment just means action.
Action. Intervention. Allocating resources to reduce the risk. Something has to be done. So if your project's potential cost overrun, for example, crosses that dollar threshold, the project manager, loses their authority to just keep going. They need immediate corrective action or escalation.
And this is where the ambiguity starts creeping in during real-world meetings, isn't it?
Absolutely. One of the most common practical inconsistencies is that professionals will often use the term risk appetite when what they actually mean is risk threshold.
They just focus on that one hard boundary.
Exactly. They look at the maximum acceptable level and they call it the appetite. But
Yeah.
while the threshold defines the appetite's upper limit, it's only one point on the spectrum. It's not the entire range of acceptable risk.
So understanding that distinction, that the appetite covers all acceptable levels up to that threshold, is essential if you want to sound like you really know what you're talking about.
Precisely. The key to clarity is just remembering. Threshold is a single quantifiable boundary, while appetite describes the entire acceptable area below that boundary.
Got it. Okay, now let's talk about the cultural element. Risk attitude. This term, especially when you pair it with appetite, it sounds almost identical.
It does. But the difference is profound. Attitude is the mindset. Appetite is the measurement.
And this is where that RARA model risk attitude and risk appetite becomes so useful, right?
It's invaluable. It's the best tool for separating the subjective culture from the objective measurement. So risk attitude is the organization's approach to risk. It's a qualitative cultural disposition. It describes how the organization assesses, pursues, retains, or, turns away from uncertainty.
So, is the company inherently pessimistic or optimistic when they're estimating future events? That's attitude.
That's attitude, exactly.
So if attitude is the organizational personality, cautious, aggressive, reactive, how does that connect to appetite, which we said is about the amount?
Think of attitude as the gravitational pull of the company culture. And appetite is the measurable speed limit on the highway. Risk attitude influences the choice of the risk thresholds.
Oh, I see.
If the cultural attitude is highly cautious, the governance body, the board, will naturally choose to set a very low, easily reachable threshold. Meanwhile, risk appetite is the amount and type of risk. It's a quantification or the categorization. The attitude helps you choose the number. The appetite is the actual number written down in the policy. They're symbiotic, but they're not interchangeable.
That distinction really clarifies the willingness element of all this. But now we have to introduce the most critical constraint, the term that stops willingness from becoming just pure recklessness: risk tolerance.
Yes.
This is where we move from desire to actual capability.
This is the defining differentiator.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be hammered home for any decision maker. It is so important. So to reiterate, risk appetite is how much risk the organization is willing to take on. It's a strategic choice. Risk tolerance is fundamentally structural. It is how much risk the organization is capable of taking on. And this is determined not by choice or desire, but by hard structural constraints. Things like regulatory mandates, think capital requirements in banking contractual obligations, available capital reserves, insurance coverage limits, and market constraints, like your ability to access liquidity during a crisis.
So my appetite might be dictated by my ambition, but my tolerance is dictated by the regulations I have to follow and the actual money I have in the bank.
Precisely. And this leads to the absolute defining rule of all risk management. An organization's risk threshold, their chosen maximum appetite, must always be lower than or equal to its risk tolerance, its maximum structural capacity.
But doesn't the regulation, the tolerance, often just become the appetite? I mean, how do companies avoid just adopting the lowest common denominator that's mandated by law? If a regulator tells me I have to have X amount in capital reserves, doesn't that reserve level just become my de facto appetite since it sets the limit?
That is a brilliant challenge to it, and it highlights the operational reality for a lot of firms. For heavily regulated industries, finance especially, tolerance often constrains appetite so tightly that they can look almost identical. However, the distinction remains strategic. A mature, well-governed bank might have a regulatory tolerance that allows it to run, say, a 10-to-1 leverage ratio. But its board, exercising strategic choice, might set its appetite threshold at a very cautious 5-to-1 ratio.
So they're providing a massive buffer against unexpected volatility.
A massive buffer. They're choosing to be significantly less risky than their capacity actually allows. They're sacrificing potential return, their appetite, to ensure maximum safety, which is their tolerance. The moment a company loses that strategic separation and tries to push its appetite past its tolerance limit, they enter the realm of unacceptable risk.
Can you explain unacceptable risk in this context? What does that mean?
Exposure past the risk tolerance limit is unacceptable risk because it simply won't pass the organization's own risk acceptance criteria. It jeopardizes the organization's solvency, it violates regulatory covenants, it risks irreversible reputational damage, it means the potential consequences are structurally unrecoverable.
And you see this in corporate history.
All the time. Many large corporate failures, and not just because of fraud, but because of mismanaged rapid expansion, they all stemmed from leadership's appetite, exceeding the organization's true stress-tested tolerance. They bit off more than they could possibly chew.
Okay, let's use the practical example from the source material, the loan scenario. It ties all these terms together so well, and I think it will give maximum clarity for the listener.
Perfect. Let's imagine a technology firm. They're considering a major capital investment, and they're probably going to need a loan. First, the firm does its risk management analysis. They stress test their balance sheet, they calculate their collateral, they review their debt covenants, and they conclude that structurally they are capable of sustaining up to, say, $100,000 in additional debt without jeopardizing their core operations.
So that $100,000 figure is their risk tolerance.
That's the hard limit, the ceiling imposed by capability. They cannot go above that.
Okay, what's next?
Next, the board and the strategic leadership, guided by their risk attitude, let's say they're generally cautious, they decide how much debt they're willing to take on to meet their current growth objectives. They agree that a $50,000 loan represents the highest prudent exposure they want to embrace.
So that $50,000, that becomes the risk threshold. It's the absolute upper boundary of their willingness.
Correct. And finally, the entire spectrum of choices, from $1 all the way up to that $50,000 limit, where management is defining acceptable exposure for different levels of damage or operational impact. That defines the full scope of their risk appetite.
They're choosing to operate well within their structural capacity.
Exactly.
And what if they decided to take a $105,000 loan based purely on an aggressive appetite, just because they wanted to?
That extra $5,000, the amount past the $100,000 limit, is instantly unacceptable risk. It's structurally impossible for them to absorb that potential loss, and no amount of managerial willingness or ambition can change that fundamental reality.
So that sequence appetite, which is willingness, always being constrained by tolerance, which is capability, that is the most important lesson in this entire deep dive.
It absolutely is.
The loan example really grounds the theory brilliantly. But as we've noted, organizational risk isn't always financial. You can quantify debt, that's easy. But how do you measure your appetite when the risk is, say, reputational damage, or the failure of a disruptive new product, or the morale impact of a major restructuring?
That is precisely why precise quantitative measurement just isn't always possible. When we deal with these non-financial risks, organizations have to rely on broad strategic statements or a system of qualitative categories to define their risk approach.
And this gives us the risk appetite spectrum.
Yes. It provides a personality framework for risk-taking.
And this spectrum is where the organizational culture towards risk really shines through. It gives specific language for aligning action with strategy. And it's critical for making sure that, say, a project manager isn't acting in total opposition to the board's overarching philosophy. Let's walk through the 5 qualitative levels, starting at the lowest, most extreme end.
Okay, we begin with the organization that adopts an averse appetite. For this group, the avoidance of risk and uncertainty isn't just a preference, it is a key organizational objective. Their whole mission is defined by absolute stability and predictability.
And what's the archetype here? Who has to be averse?
You have to think about organizations dealing with irreversible, high-impact consequences. A regulatory body that oversees the safety of air traffic control, for example, or a nuclear power station operator.
Failure is not an option.
Not an option. Their mandate is failure prevention above all else. They must tolerate zero deviation from strict protocol, and their appetite for any uncertainty is effectively nil. Every single decision has to be filtered through the lens of minimizing likelihood and minimizing impact, even if it means sacrificing huge amounts of operational efficiency or profit potential.
Okay, moving up just a little bit from that, we find the minimal appetite.
Minimal means the organization prefers ultra-safe, low-risk options. They're seeking preservation and continuity over growth, and they know this approach only offers the potential for very limited rewards. They're willing to accept some unavoidable risk, but they actively resist any path that introduces unnecessary volatility.
What does that look like in the real world?
Consider a large, mature, regulated utility company, one that maintains critical public infrastructure, like a power grid or water system. Their core business provides stable, limited returns. They're only going to invest in necessary, proven upgrades to their infrastructure, and they will only approve new projects that adhere to an ultra-low probability of failure. The objective is just to maintain service continuity and generate reliable, if unexciting, quarterly returns.
The next step up from that is cautious. And this feels like where a lot of large established companies tend to live. What's the key difference between minimal and cautious?
The cautious organization is a bit more proactive. They still prefer safe options and a low degree of risk, but they are actively looking for limited potential for reward. The key difference is really their approach to innovation.
How so?
A minimal company avoids new technology unless they're forced to by aging infrastructure. A cautious company, on the other hand, will adopt a new technology, but only after extensive piloting, vendor vetting, and proof that their competitors have already successfully deployed it.
So a cautious organization might expand into a new adjacent geographical market, but they're going to hedge their bets heavily. They'll enter through a joint venture maybe and only deploy proven non-disruptive business models. They take calculated low-stakes risks where the payoff, even if it's small, is highly probable.
That is the strategic profile, exactly. Then we reach the middle of the road, the open appetite. This is the appetite of the actively competitive organization. An open appetite signals a willingness to consider all viable options, including some that involve moderate uncertainty, and then choose the one most likely to succeed while providing an acceptable level of reward and value for money.
So it's a very rational approach.
Very rational. They're not chasing moonshots, but they're also not paralyzed by caution. They embrace measured uncertainty as just part of the competition.
This could describe a major software company that's focused on iterative improvements, not radical shifts. Or a manufacturer focused on optimizing its existing global supply chain. They're seeking the best route, not just the safest one, but they need the math to back it up.
And finally, we hit the top of the spectrum. Hungry. This is the profile of disruption.
This is Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. A hungry appetite means the organization is eager to be innovative. They're selecting options that offer potentially huge business rewards despite the greater inherent risk. They understand that a high percentage of these ventures will probably fail. The breakthrough success of the few that do succeed will dramatically alter their market standing and their return on investment.
And the archetypes here are obvious. The biotech startup in its Series A funding round, a venture capital fund betting on nascent AI, or the research division within a huge pharmaceutical company. They aren't just accepting failure. Their risk framework actively budgets for and encourages high-risk experimentation. They use failure as a necessary stepping stone to success.
And the ability for an organization to place itself correctly on this spectrum and to communicate that placement clearly is what ensures internal alignment. Without these categories, how would the head of IT know whether to invest in bleeding-edge security software, which is a hungry choice, or stick with a decade-old proven system, a minimal choice?
That distinction between the 5 levels is so essential because it just dismantles the myth that a company has one single risk appetite. In reality, large organizations are intensely multidimensional.
Absolutely. You cannot run an organization with a singular monolithic appetite. As we noted, a company might be averse to financial leverage, refusing to take on new debt, but at the same time be hungry for technical innovation, pouring capital into R&D that has a high chance of failure.
Let's take that classic split. The research and development department is encouraged to fail fast, fail often. Their operational risk appetite is firmly hungry. Meanwhile, the Treasury Department that manages the organization's cash reserves and daily liquidity needs, they are definitively averse. They prioritize capital preservation and regulatory compliance above everything.
This is a fundamental challenge. The R&D team needs a budget to run 10 expensive, high-risk experiments. The Treasury team sees those 10 experiments as a direct threat to their capital preservation strategy.
So what's the solution?
The necessity, then, is an overarching framework set by the board that reconciles these different appetites. The framework has to articulate that the financial risk associated with all those R&D projects must never, collectively, violate the averse financial tolerance set by Treasury, which itself is based on regulatory capital requirements. The hunger has to be strictly limited to the R&D sandbox.
So the framework is the mechanism for ensuring that the total sum of all the individual specialized risks taken across the entire organization doesn't exceed the enterprise-wide structural capacity, the risk tolerance.
Exactly. And while these qualitative categories are really useful for cultural alignment, we have to strive for quantitative measurement wherever we can. How do organizations move from a word like cautious to a concrete, actionable number?
That's the key question.
They align the appetite definition with their standard risk metrics, the same ones they use to define impact and likelihood. A qualitative statement is, frankly, useless to a project manager. A number is actionable. So for a major infrastructure project, instead of just stating, we are cautious about schedule slippage, the organization defines the appetite by setting key performance indicators or KPIs.
Give me an example.
It would sound like this. Maximum acceptable project delay is 4 weeks for phase 1, or a cost overrun exposure greater than $150,000. Operating past this threshold requires executive intervention.
That turns the qualitative concept into a measurable metric. It tells the decision maker exactly what level of acceptable loss they can tolerate before they have to escalate the issue or stop the work or trigger a contingency plan.
And that is the difference between organizational philosophy and operational policy.
So we've established the definitions, the boundaries, the measurement tools. Now let's talk about implementation. Who, organizationally, has the authority and the responsibility to set this critical philosophical framework?
The setting of risk appetite is a foundational element of organizational governance. So it must originate at the highest level.
The very top.
The very top. For large publicly traded companies, the board of directors is explicitly responsible. Our sources, they reference governance structures like the UK's Financial Reporting Council, and they make it very clear that the board determines the nature and extent of the significant risks the company is willing to embrace.
It has to come from the top because it is fundamentally a strategic statement about how the company intends to survive and compete and generate returns for its shareholders. It's an articulation of their competitive strategy.
It is. However, the operation of the appetite is delegated. Once the board sets the broad strategic goals, the hungry or averse designation, for instance, the day-to-day decision-making is passed down. And this is where authorizing officials come in.
And these are the people on the front lines making the specific risk acceptance decisions.
Correct. They are empowered to accept risk, but only within clearly defined thresholds. The organizational structure has to link the severity of the potential loss to the required seniority of the decision maker.
That makes sense.
A mid-level IT manager, for example, might have the authority to accept a risk exposure, like system downtime, up to maybe a $5,000 threshold. If the potential loss exposure crosses a higher threshold, say $100,000, that acceptance criterion requires authorization from a vice president.
And if it crosses the enterprise-wide financial tolerance?
Then it requires CFO or even board approval. This system is what ensures that the operational reality actually adheres to the strategic appetite set at the top.
And this framework is so intensely context-dependent. We mentioned this earlier, but let's look at the crucial high and low appetite contexts again, just to reinforce why the RA shifts so wildly based on the organizational objective.
Let's start with a low appetite context. For organizations where public safety and irreversible consequences are paramount, the appetite has to be averse.
We go back to the nuclear power station.
The nuclear power station or air traffic control. In these systems, operational efficiency is secondary. Their processes have to be designed with massive redundancy and really conservative margins. They accept that this low appetite results in huge capital expenditure on safety and slower, more deliberate processes because the alternative is just catastrophic.
So the objective there is preservation. But conversely, let's look at the high appetite context. We use the example of a pharmaceutical company in early drug discovery, or maybe a team developing a complex, disruptive computer program.
Here, the objective is disruption and breakthrough. They realize that 90% of their attempts are going to fail. Therefore, their risk appetite is hungry. They accept short-term failure and capital burn as necessary inputs to the process. The framework mandates that they fail fast, they iterate, and they use that failure to inform the next, hopefully more successful, attempt. The key difference is that the failure of one drug trial is reversible. The failure of a nuclear plant is not. The reversibility of failure heavily influences the acceptable appetite.
Okay, so what's the payoff? I mean, beyond simply tracking risk, what are the measurable benefits for an organization that really commits to rigorously defining and implementing its risk appetite framework?
The benefits, they touch the entire nervous system of the organization, from strategy to budget to culture. The first major benefit is balance. As we've discussed, defining RA achieves an appropriate balance. It provides a strategic, defined sandbox for innovators to play in without letting them recklessly risk the entire company's capital. It acts as a governor on strategic ambition.
The second is consistency. This is so critical for preventing organizational friction. A defined appetite guides every single decision maker on the permitted level of risk, and that ensures consistency across every department and every project.
Without a defined appetite, you just get chaos. One manager is aggressively pushing boundaries while their peer is paralyzed by excessive caution, and that leads to missed opportunities and a lot of internal conflict.
And the third, and maybe the most practical benefit.
Improved resource allocation and efficiency. If an organization defines an acceptable level of retained risk for a certain category, say maximum financial loss exposure of $50,000,
Right.
and their current operational risk is only at $5,000, they have a clear signal.
A signal not to spend more money.
Exactly. They do not need to spend an additional $1 million to reduce that risk even further. Resources aren't wasted on mitigating risks that are already at a structurally acceptable level. And this alone can save enormous amounts of capital and prevent a lot of unnecessary bureaucracy.
That focus on efficiency is a really powerful argument for formalizing these concepts. Finally, let's just briefly touch on the practical areas where these definitions are applied. The sources identify 6 main topical areas where organizations have to define their RA.
These are the major risk domains that require an explicit strategic definition of willingness. We start with financial risk. This is the classic application defining comfort levels with debt, liquidity, investment strategies, trading positions, all of that. Next is health risk.
Which is more than just hard hats.
Much more. It covers not just immediate employee safety protocols and equipment, but also long-term liabilities, ergonomic design, and even mental well-being initiatives.
Okay, third is recreational risk. This one might seem low priority, but it involves organizational liability in things like corporate-sponsored activities, team-building excursions.
And how far the company is willing to go to encourage specific employee behaviors, like extreme sports or high-risk travel, as part of a wellness program.
The fourth and fifth are increasingly critical: ethical risk and social risk.
Ethical risk defines the organization's comfort level with decisions that might push the boundaries of business practices, for example, getting involved in controversial markets, or how far they're willing to push intellectual property law. Social risk is tightly linked to that.
How so?
It deals with reputation management, community impact, and the level of tolerance for public dissent or negative media coverage related to their operations.
And this is where the appetite becomes really challenging to quantify. An organization might be hungry for a financial return, but then discover that a sudden averse attitude is necessary for social risk after a major public outcry.
Absolutely. And finally, information risk. This is the contemporary critical area. It's about defining the appetite for exposure to cybersecurity threats, data breaches, and ensuring the integrity and compliance of internal data systems.
A high appetite here could mean adopting new, unproven AI software for efficiency.
And a low appetite means sticking to hardened proprietary networks.
Looking at those 6, the multidimensional nature is crystal clear. A global bank might be completely averse in financial and information risk, but cautious or even open in recreational risk to boost employee morale and retention. That strategic juggling act must be immense. So this deep dive has really focused on turning that dense organizational jargon into actionable clarity. For you, the listener, the key takeaway is that risk appetite is a deliberate analytical choice that flows directly from rigorous risk management. It's the organization's expression of its willingness to act.
And crucially, it has to be distinguished clearly from its risk tolerance, that hard limit of its capability imposed by structural constraints, and its risk attitude, which is the underlying cultural mindset.
Mastering those distinctions is what allows professionals to move beyond just, compliance and toward true strategic advantage.
It provides the framework for smart decision-making that seeks gain while avoiding structural catastrophe.
And that leads us to a final, provocative thought for you to consider as you reflect on all this material. We've established that complex organizations necessitate these conflicting internal appetites. A safety team has to be averse. A finance team might be hungry. The real challenge is in the coordination.
So the question to leave you with is this. Given that these internal teams often compete for the exact same capital and resources, how does a global company successfully reconcile and coordinate an averse attitude in one critical area with a hungry attitude in another, without creating systemic internal conflict, or accidentally allowing the sum of all its risk decisions to violate the hard tolerance limit of the entire enterprise? That overarching framework requires constant vigilance and some very difficult trade-offs.